Hello, students of history and political science. I'm Mr. Tesh, and welcome to Global Chat, where we explore the ins and outs of the field of study known as comparative politics. In this video, we're going to talk about non-democratic regimes, or political systems that deny their citizens participation, competition, and liberty. There are many different terms to describe and distinguish between authoritarian regimes, including autocracy, oligarchy, dictatorship, and tyranny. Some authoritarian regimes even look just like democracies, which makes classifying them even more challenging. Let's start by defining some common types of non-democratic regimes that we're going to come across. When we think about non-democratic regimes, we often picture monarchies. In a monarchy, the ruler is not a subject of the state, but rather the state and society are subjects of the ruler. We learn about many of these kinds of regimes in history and love to tell stories about famous kings, Caesars, emperors, sultans, chiefs, and caudillos. Until around the middle of the 20th century, monarchies were the rule and republics the exception. Today, monarchies have become much more rare. In terms of absolute monarchies, Saudi Arabia is one of just a handful of countries in the world in which the king is unrestricted by laws. Slightly more common in the world today are military regimes. These kinds of regimes often emerge through an overthrow, as military leaders seize power from a government in something called a coup d'etat, French for cutting off the head. Many Latin American and African states have a history of military rule. Nigeria, for example, has had 3 military governments in the last 60 years. When Nigeria first became independent of British colonial rule in 1963, it was established as a parliamentary democracy. Very quickly, though, the religious cleavage between the largely Muslim North and Christian South gave way to a violent political conflict. The large number of seats held by northern Muslims led southern Christians to become deeply resentful. And in 1966, the Nigerian military southern general staged a coup d'etat, assassinating the Nigerian prime minister. From 1967 until 1970, a brutal civil war followed, pitting North against South. In that time, the region of Biafra succeeded, and it was only through vicious fighting and support from British troops that Nigeria was able to be reunified in 1970. Until 1979, Nigeria continued to be governed as a military dictatorship by Generals Murtala Muhammad and Olusegun Obasanjo. Sadly, this pattern of instability repeated itself in Nigeria for several decades. In 2000, Nigeria made a 4th attempt at establishing a constitutional republic following a brutal military dictatorship of General Sani Abacha. This regime persists to the present day, and several peaceful transitions of power give us some hope for Nigeria's future as the most populous country in West Africa. Political scientists define a consolidated democracy as one that is unlikely to revert to authoritarianism, and that broadly embraces democratic institutions. And while Nigeria is now governed by elected officials, major problems such as widespread corruption, conflict over natural resources, and divisive ethnic cleavages have remained. Because of this, Nigeria might be characterized as an emerging democracy. Now at this point, you may be wondering, well, what's missing? What does it take to be considered a consolidated democracy? Consolidated democracies have widespread acceptance of democratic norms, institutions, and civil liberties. Even more importantly, consolidated democracies are unlikely to revert to authoritarianism. And while Nigeria has now had 20 years of peaceful transitions of power between different presidential administrations, large problems still remain. Another prevalent type of non-democratic regime is the party state, in which a single ruling party monopolizes control over a state. Perhaps the most famous example of this kind of regime is China, where the Chinese Communist Party has held power since 1949. The party selects all members of China's legislature, the National People's Congress, as well as China's head of state. Because other political parties are not allowed to hold government office or wield power, membership and participation in the party are necessary for anyone who would want to hold an influential role in the bureaucracy or the state. Like that of other states, China's government is made up of 3 branches: a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary. Primarily, the difference between China and more democratic countries is that its branches of government are not equal and do not have the ability to check the power of one another. The judiciary essentially just serves as an arm of the executive. The Supreme People's Court, the highest court of China's judicial system, hears cases and decides sentences, but unlike other Supreme Courts that we learn about, it simply does not have the power of judicial review. That power rests instead with the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, and all laws are subject to approval by the ruling Communist Party. In this way, the Chinese Communist Party controls every level of China's government. And since China does not have competitive elections, the Chinese Communist Party will continue to hold power for the foreseeable future. The party justifies such a monopoly on political power by claiming that it is the sole agency capable of maintaining the political stability that makes the remarkable degree of economic development that China has been experiencing over the last several decades possible. Like other single-party states, the Chinese Communist Party also maintains its monopoly on power by restricting activity by civil society. Shortly after it was first established in 1949, the National People's Congress passed the Interim Provision on Registration of Social Organizations, which required all major groups outside of the main political system in China to register with the government. The new administration was concerned with outside groups posing a potential threat to the government. To not only monitor, but control their activities, non-governmental organizations became vehicles for the government's control over the public. This includes everything from organizations that provide public services, such as the Red Cross, to religious organizations, such as Christian and Buddhist groups. But while single-party regimes are often associated with communism and fascism, as they have been in the Soviet Union and in China, they can also be found in other non-democratic regimes. Mexico was long dominated by the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI as it's known. The PRI was first ascended to power in 1929, shortly after the Mexican Revolution and the adoption of a constitution. The party continued to control the presidency, the legislature, and even state governments of Mexico until around 2000, when a candidate from an opposition party won the presidency for the first time. In order to hold on to power for 71 years, the PRI had to be ideologically flexible. Beginning in 1934, President Lázaro Cárdenas increased the role of the government in the economy by implementing land reform, labor reform, and nationalizing major industries such as the oil industry in Mexico. These policies might rightly be referred to as leftist policies, but within a few short years, by 1946 to be exact, President Miguel Alemán was busy reversing many of Cárdenas's policies, implementing instead liberal reforms by encouraging entrepreneurship and inviting foreign investment in Mexico. This back and forth of economic policy shows just how flexible the PRI could be in ideological terms, and it allowed the party to incorporate groups of otherwise very different political interests. Like the Chinese Communist Party, Mexico's PRI also brought other linkage institutions under its control. In the late 1930s, the Confederation of Mexican Workers, or CTM, Mexico's largest confederation of labor unions, was incorporated into the PRI as the party's labor sector. This gave the CTM a great deal of power in influencing the government's policy, such as helping to determine which unions were officially recognized or whether or not strikes would be considered legal. What's more, the CTM received subsidies from the party and was guaranteed a seat in the Senate. In order to prevent the CTM from becoming a challenge to the legitimacy of the party, President Cárdenas prevented the CTM from representing civil servants. This is just one example of how the PRI government worked to maintain its monopoly on power by co-opting civil society organizations. Since 2000, what amounts to a single-party state has also emerged in Russia, but in a very different way than it has in China or Mexico. Shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia reconstituted itself as the Russian Federation, with Boris Yeltsin serving as president. During his years in office, Yeltsin faced two massive challenges. One, transforming the Russian regime from an authoritarian to a democratic one, and two, overseeing the transition away from a state-controlled economy to one based on free market principles. On both fronts, Yeltsin faced immense challenges. Transforming Russia's economy meant rapidly privatizing Russia's industry, all of which had formerly been controlled by the state. You'll often hear observers of Russian politics refer to this rapid overhaul as shock therapy. The problem of privatization, though, was that these industries would now have to be owned by somebody, and in most cases, that somebody would be a former elite from within the Communist Party, who would purchase controlling shares in these newly privatized companies. These businessmen quickly became extraordinarily wealthy, and we refer to them today as oligarchs. For the Russian people, the oligarchs' close ties to the Russian government creates the appearance of a ruling class who use their power and influence to benefit themselves. And to be fair, the people are not exactly wrong in this. Now today, Russia again owns a great deal of massive gas and, to a slightly lesser extent, oil industries, and this is just another way in which the government can now use key positions within these industries to reward those who are loyal to and supportive of the regime. In terms of transforming the political system, Yeltsin faced a totally different challenge. Democratization requires a society with a political culture that is open to embracing democratic values. Through a century of communist rule and centuries of autocratic rule before that, Russia's society had never really become acquainted with the idea of electoral politics or the ideals of individual liberty, equality, and the rule of law. Instead, the Russian people had always been ruled either by czars or communist dictators who reigned without constraint. In the Soviet Union, being a good citizen meant supporting the Communist Party. In schools, in the media, and Russian life in general, unity was encouraged, debate discouraged, and capitalism and democracy were denounced as evils of the Western world, and thus the enemy. And so it is, to this day, that Russian presidents don't rise to their position through a party, but it's the other way around. Russian presidents are elected, and the parties that they support gain in popularity because of them, and then electoral favorability. And that's exactly what happened when Yeltsin resigned in 1999 and gave his office to Prime Minister Vladimir Putin. In the parliamentary elections that followed in 2003, an alliance of two political parties called Unity and Fatherland All Russia, supported by Vladimir Putin, became the biggest party in the Duma, Russia's lower but more powerful legislative house. Now known as United Russia, this alliance became a kind of party of power for Vladimir Putin, passing legislation that he called for rather than serving as an independent body and check on presidential power. You will hear us refer to Russia as a procedural democracy. In a procedural democracy, citizens have less influence over government and policy than citizens in a substantive democracy. Russia can also be referred to as a hybrid regime, which is another one of those complicated words that refers to several different things about Russia's system of government. The rule of law in Russia is weakly established. Putin has overwhelming power, often relying on referendums to override legislature. And political competition is often curtailed as candidates are barred from running for office and are even jailed. So far, we can clearly see how authoritarian regimes allow for the exercise of political power with less participation or input of the societies that they govern. In this context, we should also discuss theocratic regimes, where democratic institutions are made subordinate to religious laws. Iran is a great example of a theocratic regime. In 1979, supporters of the religious scholar Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the existing secular monarchy. In the same year, Iran adopted a constitution that over 99.5% of voters approved of in a referendum. This constitution gave Khomeini the title of supreme leader, which means he has the power over the law, the military, and the political system. Khomeini's idea of an Islamic government became popularized in Iran after his book, Velayat-e-Faqih, was published in 1970, the English translation of which is simply called Islamic Government. In it, Khomeini argues that only by establishing an Islamic government under the guardianship of a scholar on Islam could an Islamic society truly thrive and adhere to its religious tenets. His ideas and the constitution that was born out of them were quite progressive, aiming to curtail what he called the oppression and the plundering of the weak by the powerful. In other ways, Khomeini's ideas also reflect a reaction to the influence of Western culture. One of the things that catapulted Khomeini to power was the way in which he tapped into the strong anti-Western sentiment in Iranian society. For the past century, it is fair to say that Iran has been taken advantage of and even exploited by Western countries. This exploitation began early in the 1900s, when the British established what was to be the precursor for British Petroleum, or BP, in Iran, extracting Iranian oil in exchange for a share of those profits. It wasn't long before the British leveraged their massive power to keep a larger and larger share of the profits from the sale of Iranian oil. In 1951, this led a coalition of leftist and nationalist parties in Iran's legislature to choose Mohammad Mossadegh to serve as prime minister. Now, Mossadegh's main policy priority was to nationalize Iranian oil in order to fund major social democratic reforms that he planned to undertake. The way he and his supporters saw it, profits from the sale of Iranian oil could be used to benefit the people of Iran and not the owners of foreign companies like British Petroleum or BP. The British government, of course, saw this differently and referred to the nationalization of Iranian oil as theft. Together with allies around the world, Britain imposed an embargo on Iran. An embargo, by the way, is a ban on trade with a particular country. By 1953, the United States' Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, had worked with the British government to support and fund protests against Mossadegh, which succeeded in pressuring the Prime Minister into resigning and eventually fleeing Iran. Following Mossadegh's departure, there was an assassination attempt on Mohammad Reza Shah, who at the time was Iran's monarch, which prompted him to make major structural changes to Iran's constitution to increase his own authority and power. In the decades that followed, the Shah was able to institute some successful reforms, including extending education to more rural regions of Iran, promoting literacy, building new universities, and making large investments in major industries such as telecommunications and steel. Despite these achievements, a large segment of the Iranian people were distrustful of the Shah. Things came to a head in 1978 when a series of protests across the country were brutally suppressed by the Iranian military. Predictably, this led to mass demonstrations in the streets, and ultimately the Shah was forced to flee the country. Reza Shah ended up in the United States of all places, where he was reluctantly granted entry by President Jimmy Carter in order to undergo cancer treatment. Meanwhile, the Iranian government demanded that Reza Shah be returned home in order to stand trial for the brutal manner in which his administration had repressed protesters. Outraged that the Shah was given refuge in the United States, a group of Iranian demonstrators stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. The hostages were only released well over a year later. The relationship between Iran and the United States was already very tense after the incident with Minister Mossadegh, and the hostage crisis further weakened ties between the two countries. Today, over 40 years later, Iran's relationship with the West is as tense as it's ever been. To understand why, we need to look back to history again, to 2015, when Iran agreed to an arrangement to give up its pursuit of developing nuclear weapons. Iran made this Iran nuclear deal, as it's called, with the United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the rest of the European Union. The deal was remarkable for a number of reasons. First, Iran's citizens and their distrust of Western countries made it unlikely that Iran's elected leaders would be able to accept a deal with these countries. Second, the agreement that they reached severely curtailed Iran's ability to enrich uranium and required Iran to allow thorough inspections of its nuclear facilities at practically any time. In exchange for accepting such strict terms, the United States and its allies agreed to relieve sanctions that they had placed on Iran. In August of 2018, though, the United States President Donald Trump announced that the United States would withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. Exactly why the US president made this decision is still unclear, but whatever the reason may be, one thing is certain. The relationship between Iran, the United States, and other Western countries is as uneasy today as it's ever been, if not more so. Through Iran, we can see that international relations can play an important role in leading to the emergence of an authoritarian regime. The Iranian people are very proud, patriotic, and even nationalistic. In Khomeini's leadership, many Iranians found a vision for a country that could determine its own path and direction, free from foreign meddling. And in practice, Khomeini's political philosophy has manifested itself in a regime that does not extend political participation to the people. Instead, it's become one in which a class of clerical elites make decisions for the state, justifying their right to rule through religion. And although Iran holds elections for its legislature and even its president, it really is not what we would call a democracy. One feature that all of the authoritarian regimes that we discussed share is that they are less tolerant of critical viewpoints that may challenge their legitimacy. In terms of the media, democratic regimes generally tolerate a high degree of media freedom to encourage citizen control of the political agenda and to check political power and corruption. Authoritarian regimes, on the other hand, do not. In April of 2001, for example, the Russian national gas company Gazprom acquired NTV, a popular free-to-air television station that aired commentary and comedies critical of President Vladimir Putin and the Russian government. Since then, political speech on NTV has been far more restrained, and from what we know for certain, is not aired without the advice, consent, or oversight of key Kremlin advisors. This same tactic has been employed across various media outlets in Russia, and it has become increasingly rare for the Russian people to hear criticism of their government in print, on television, or even on social media. Like Russia, Iran's media is also censored by the government. The Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance is a government agency in Iran that restricts access to any media that violates Islamic ethics or goes against the principles of the Iranian Revolution. This means that any scene that is in some way objectionable or critical of Iran's regime may be censored. Publishing houses are required to receive licenses before publishing books, and filmmakers are often required to remove any scenes that are considered lewd or suggestive. What's interesting about Iran is that the ministry justifies its censorship on the basis of religion, making their intentions nearly impossible to question. Something as small as a single line in a film might be considered political or critical of the government. That alone is enough to ask for that scene to be removed or changed. China's censorship arm is perhaps the most advanced in the entire world today, but it doesn't bother with the kinds of pretenses that Iran's Ministry of Culture or Russia's roundabout control of the media make. The Great Firewall is staffed by tens of thousands of police who review millions of messages, online posts, websites, and other content every single day. Any word, phrase, or even internet meme that might be considered critical of the regime is subject to immediate censorship, and its author can face rather serious consequences for uttering it in the first place. As we have talked about on this channel before, China's Communist Party goes to these lengths in order to maintain its monopoly on political power. Authoritarian regimes are also less likely to allow political participation through voting, especially when doing so might amplify critical viewpoints or restrict the government's control over policy. Where voting is allowed, authoritarian regimes may restrict opposition candidates from running for office. As we have seen in Russia, the government often intervenes in elections to ensure that its preferred candidates and parties win. In our last episode, we talked about Alexei Navalny and how the anti-corruption foundation that he founded was forced to register as a foreign agent in Russia in order to restrict its activities. Alexei Navalny has also been arrested multiple times for being involved in organizing unauthorized protests. These kinds of actions by the Russian government serve as rather blatant examples of election interference. In recent years, accusations of ballot stuffing and altered election ballots have also become more credible, as evidence of electioneering has mounted in Russia. Like Russia, the Iranian government reduces the ability of candidates who would rock the boat or make dramatic changes to the status quo to participate in the political process. The difference is that Iran has a state institution that is responsible for doing just that. Known as the Guardian Council, this institution is made up of 12 members who are given the constitutional authority to oversee elections, bar candidates from running for office, and overturn laws passed by the legislature. In the 2008 and 2012 Majlis elections, the Guardian Council barred 40% of candidates for the legislature as unsuitable. In 2013, all but 8 of 686 candidates were blocked. This year, Iran is holding legislative elections, but so many candidates have been blocked that many constituencies do not even have reformist candidates on the ballot. In effect, elections in Iran have become appointments led by Supreme Leader Khamenei, as even sitting members of the legislature have been barred from running. But while Russia and Iran have electoral systems that reduce the amount of influence that citizens have over policymaking and who's in charge, countries like China go much, much further in limiting the ability of their citizens to vote. None of the officials in China's major state institutions are elected in the first place. This includes the National People's Congress, the State Council, the Supreme People's Court, and even the presidency itself. Instead, positions within these institutions are effectively selected by the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese government does, however, allow for direct elections for local congresses at the county, city, township, and village level. Nominations for candidates in these local elections, however, are again controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So whatever we call them, and despite the differences in the ways that they operate, What is common to all non-democratic regimes is that they are built around the restriction of individual freedom, the elimination of the people's right to choose among candidates for public office, and a reduction of influence over policymaking or legislation by the people. In this episode, we've discussed various types of non-democratic regimes, the different ways in which non-democratic regimes maintain control, and some of the features that all non-democratic regimes share. For more information and additional resources, please check in the description below this video. And please remember to subscribe to catch more of our videos. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.